an ultimate global podcast. Hello, and welcome to our special weekly podcast on trending international and social affairs. You're listening to Saurabh Kora and George Mavros from Sydney.
Well, welcome to another exciting series of episodes that we are doing here on the CEOs, founders, and co-founders. We've been doing this series for quite some time now. We have invited around more than 10 founders or CEOs till now. So it's another episode with another CEO. And it's always good to understand from different CEOs and different founders about their stories, about the businesses that they run, because there is so much to learn from every little thing that they are doing, whether they are at the beginning of their journey or they are somewhere towards establishing their business. But I'm being joined by Michael Batko, who's the CEO of Startmate, and Startmate is kind of becoming the epicenter for a lot of startups around Australia and New Zealand. And Michael does a lot of things towards building a community of startups and helping them out in different kind of ways. Michael has been inviting me for a Saturday walk, which I have missed out on currently. Definitely going to join him in the next few weeks. But I'm going to pass it on to you, Michael. Introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what Startmate does.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much for having me. As you mentioned, I'm the CEO of Startmate itself. Startmate has existed now for 12 years, and the core of Startmate itself is a startup accelerator. So we invest in roughly 30 companies every year. We help them grow for 3 months, and we've now backed over 200 companies worth over $2 billion. And even in the last 12 years, we've actually expanded that further into what I would almost call a people accelerator. So we've actually now tapped into spaces such as helping people get into startups, but not just found one, but actually join a startup as well as invest in startups. So we now run roughly 10 programs twice a year to help you either found, join, or invest in a startup.
That's fantastic. So that would be interesting to know, Michael. How did you initially come up with this idea of kind of joining different startup founders? Was there something that you were always interested in, or was it something that sparked you after doing those jobs in the large multinational companies?
Startmate itself actually started, it was founded by Nick Chavak, who is the founder of Blackbird Ventures. So he actually came back from New York when he had a startup over there, which he sold, and he came back to Australia in 2010, and two things really struck him. Like, the first one was that there was just no venture capital in Australia. Like, there was just literally no money for startups, which is hard to imagine now. And the second one was just that there's so many awesome Australian people, which just nobody believed in, because there was just no startup industry. So back in 2010, he essentially was like, I'm going to offer that belief to those people with my time and with my money. And he brought together the first set of 25 founders and ex-founders who all put in $10,000 each into a fund to really have skin in the game, and then invested money into the first 5 companies at Startmate. So that was very much the first fund in 2010, 2011. My personal journey started with Startmate about 5 years ago when I joined Startmate as head of operations. Also quite hard to imagine, but back then Startmate was also only 2 people large. And now we're a team of 20 doing lots of other things as well. But that was kind of my beginning.
So, Michael, I see that there are a lot of projects that Startmate runs. It's not only for founders, but it's also for different kind of people. It can be for product managers. It can be for people in marketing, people doing sales. So, tell us a bit more about your different kind of programs, and what's the objective of targeting different audiences here, and what are you trying to achieve out of that?
Yeah.
And after that, I'm going to pass it on to George, who is absolutely rubbing his hands to ask you a few questions.
Awesome. Yeah. As a statement itself, like, what do we stand for? I would almost say, like, we believe in people before they believe in themselves, and then we believe in them forever after. That's kind of like the thesis of Startmate itself. The idea is that we actually help anyone get into a startup if that is something that you like to do. So we've got now fellowship programs such as our Women Fellowship, Student Fellowship, an Athlete Fellowship, a Climate Fellowship that literally helps people from corporates, from universities, from hospitality, from retail, even just get started, like even just explore what a startup even looks like. Not even just start one, but like just dip your toes into the water of what it means to work in a startup. Literally believing in you that you can actually do this before you even have the confidence yourself. The second part then is actually becoming upskilling and kind of staying in the community, becoming better. So what you mentioned there, we have now a product fellowship. We've got a customer success fellowship. We are launching a bunch of other fellowships as well to essentially upskill in your craft within a startup. And the next journey then is whenever you're ready to be a founder, we now have then 2 other initiatives. The first one is a launch club to literally help you launch the first kind of product into the world. The second one, the accelerator, which the accelerator has existed for 12 years now. We invest $120,000 into every single one of our startups. And then when those companies go on to raise more money, to my statement of we believe in you forever after, we now have a continuity fund, which essentially always invests in your company after you've actually graduated from the accelerator. So the whole journey of actually starting a company, even before you started the company, all the way to the exit, that's where Startmate plays.
Yep, I think that's a fantastic thing which you talked about, upskilling different kinds of people, because that's also the need of the hour when people want to better up in their craft, what they are doing in their industry. So I think that's a fantastic kind of thing. But I'll pass it on to George. So George is also running his own business. He's worked in sales for so many years, and he's also part of a big community called BNI, where there are a lot of small businesses, large businesses coming together, networking, and sharing referrals. So George, do you have any questions for Michael?
Yes, I do. Firstly, glad to have you on the podcast with us, Michael. Couple of questions for you. What's the criteria used to select the companies that you then decide to back with your financial backing as opposed to educational backing? And 2, what is the success rate of the companies that you back?
Great questions. So no way into Startmate. Just to give you a little bit of an idea, we get 1,000 applications from startups every year. We accept roughly 25 to 30 companies into the cohorts. Each one of them we back with $120,000 at a $1.5 million valuation. Unless they have raised money in the past, then we match the valuation. To your specific question of like, what do we look for, or what are kind of criteria? We're completely industry agnostic. It kind of goes from software to hardware to aerospace. The current cohort actually is 40 to 50% hardware based, which is quite unusual for an accelerator. But we love that because our selection criteria itself is essentially always around the person. It's always around the founder. We are not the experts at any one of the spaces. We believe in the person, because what they're doing is, if they are actually doing something groundbreaking, nobody's got the answer. You actually have to trust that this is the person who's going to figure it out. And that is actually our kind of like area of expertise, essentially finding those people who are going to work on their life's mission, who are going to run through walls to make it happen because they care so much about their customer. And it's all about the customer at the end. And that kind of obsession for the customer, that's what we look for in the application phase. Your second question was around the success rate. The success rate itself, off the back of the accelerator, is 65 to 75% of our companies raise between $1 to $4 million, and straight off the back of the accelerator. And this is kind of like partly our success metric of like, if that is what you want to do, which is raise from venture capital, and we help you get on that path. And secondary, kind of like the metric itself is our companies are worth over $2 billion now. We've got roughly 10 companies worth anything between $100 to $300 million when we invested in them super early at like $1 million valuations.
That's a very impressive success rate.
Yeah, so this is why we've been able to stick around for 12 years. So running an accelerator is an insanely hard business model, and from a cash flow perspective, I cannot recommend it. But from the impact that you can actually have on early stage founders, it is one of the most rewarding things.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Michael, while you
What in
were
terms are you looking for as investors in these stuff?
Yeah, so what kind of returns do we look for? The kind of standard VC returns that people look for are kind of the 3x return within 10 years. It's kind of like the standard kind of venture capital model itself. At Startmate, we're fortunate that many of our funds are way above that as well, because we do invest so early on. And our multiples are way higher, because if you think about a company, actually, if we invested in $1.5 million valuation, even 100x return, like a company gets to 150 mil or 200 mil, which is not even like the billion-dollar outcome which VC funds actually need. And from an accelerator perspective, that's actually incredible investor returns themselves. So just to give you a bit of an average, like the average funds at Startmate for the last 12 years have actually been just above a 3x return. And then kind of like the older the funds, the higher it is, because it had more time to perform as well. So it's a bit of time weighted as well.
Cool.
And what have been your favorite interactions with different founders, Michael? Because you chat with a lot of people, not only through the initiatives that you just told me. I was reading about one of your stuff that you do. I don't know if it is part of your Startmate, called Puddle Pod, which sounded pretty interesting to me. So you're
Yeah.
trying to make those communities of like-minded individuals in the startup space, and at least start a conversation. I think that's a very good way to, even if they're not interested initially, but you just are engaging in some sort of conversation, and that can lead to different kind of things. So, has there been any interesting conversation with new founders or CEOs which you found, oh, that's interesting, I can apply that in my personal life, or maybe I can apply this in my professional life?
Yeah, so many, but specifically to your question of like what conversation have I had with a founder and applied it to my personal life. Actually, one really specific example comes to mind. It's actually a company called Edrolo. Edrolo is an education startup based in Victoria. They now essentially are in every single high school in Victoria. They've expanded through Australia as well. It's a company of a couple of hundred people now. They're one of our alumni. And one of their founders actually came up with a concept that they called the Edrolo operating system. And it's still something that as soon as I heard it, I implemented it, and I've been using myself now for 5 years, every single week. And the concept of Edrolo is actually just one of setting priorities and keeping yourself accountable. And the system itself is actually very simple. So every single Sunday evening or Monday morning, what I do is I block out roughly 20 minutes of my time. I open up an email template that I've created for myself, and I write down what did I do last week? What am I gonna do next week? Say thank you to a couple of team members, and send that email out to the whole company. That itself is actually just what they call the Edrolo operating system. It's just amazing because number one, it actually consciously makes me think about what are my top priorities for the next week. Number two is actually communicates it to the whole team of what am I up to, so they know how to help me and what's important to me. And three, it actually just also says a nice thank you on a Monday morning to somebody who's done a great job last week. So it's kind of like it's a really good way to focus on what's truly important.
And I think community building and networking and talking to like-minded individuals kind of it's a great thing, isn't it? When you talk to people who think like you, you can learn a lot of new things from them, and you can also introspect within your own self as to what you are doing right and what you are doing wrong. I'm sure George will have more perspective to add on this, because he's got a larger community. So, George, I think we have been discussing this with founders on networking. Do you see a different perspective coming into play here?
Look, this is a form of networking, but really what Michael's talking about is internal motivation and inspiration, and it's about generating enough energy within the group So if you've got the right group of people, it doesn't matter whether I'm being successful or you're being successful or Michael's being successful. But as one of the leaders, if he's starting off by saying, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm committed to, and thank you, it puts the team in a good frame of mind. One of the things that I always get my clients to do, Michael, is I get them to set appointments with themselves 2 to 3 times a week, where they spend that time just for themselves, because most CEOs in startups or people running small businesses, they tend to say, "Oh, well, I'll do this for everybody else, and I'll get to that at some stage." And of course, because we work on diaries so much now, somebody says, "Can I see you at such and such a time?" If there's no appointment in there, you naturally say yes. Whereas if there's an appointment for you, then you say, "Look, I can't make it that time."
I loved it.
Yeah,
That's actually exactly what I do as part of the Adrolo as well. So like whenever I set my top 3 priorities for the next week, I literally block that time out in my calendar for that week. Like, so very similar to what you said there, because you literally are blocking out the time so you don't give anybody else time, because you recognize those are the top 3 things I need to get done that week. I love that.
Yeah. And if we don't think that we're valuable, why should anybody else?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to protect your time first. Yeah.
The old days we used to talk, Sarab, about, if you're the boss, you wait for the weekend and the public holidays, because that's when you get to do your work. But that was really a poor mentality, and it was bad training of those people. It's the same as whoever came up with the great idea of the sales manager yelling and screaming and carrying on. That's so 1960s and so 1970s. You don't need it. You need to motivate people, you need to encourage people, and you need to give them enough room for them to grow.
Yeah, I love that. And the practice which we've implemented at Startmate, which I can actually highly recommend for any company, is a no meeting Wednesday, or like no meeting whatever, like one day. And we literally set it for the whole company, where we're not allowed to have any internal nor external meetings on Wednesdays. And it's actually such a nice practice, because you go into being able to do some real deep work on those days, and the whole company can, which is honestly a massive unblocker.
Yeah.
So I think this is also part of another episode that we did last year, George, where we talked about building good habits, building atomic habits, and we discussed we in fact had a discussion on this book by James Clear, where he talks about that if you can make 1% change in your life every single day of the year, you become 37 points sometimes better by the end of the year. So are there any other atomic habits or habits, Michael, that you are encouraging your cohort to start building, other than the ones that you've just pointed out, of course?
Yeah, totally. So interesting that you touch on that, because I run a community called Puddle Pod. Puddle Pod stands for Productivity Huddle Pod. And the idea is, well, firstly, the community itself, it runs every quarter. It's roughly 30 to 60 people every 3 months. And for 5 weeks, essentially, people upgrade their kind of personal lives and work lives to become a better version of themselves. And as part of that, we talk a lot about habits and establishing them from the very start. The one I just mentioned earlier, like Adrolo OS, is an excellent one. To your question of what other ones do we recommend our founders, we don't just recommend, but we insist that every single founder writes a monthly update. It's a really difficult habit for lots of founders to get into. It is one of the most useful things a founder can actually do. And the idea itself is similar to the weekly update, which I write internally in the team. The founder actually writes a monthly update, which goes out to all of their investors and stakeholders. And often they can actually involve more people in there as well, but at the very least, it's all the investors. And just in a nutshell, what that update actually has is kind of similar of like, what were my priorities last month, what are they going to be next month? But actually, the core part of it is, again, like a practice which is quite hard to start, but it is invaluable if you continue it, which is, we just call it GBU. where you essentially summarize the good, bad, and the ugly of your business. It's a very candid way to essentially summarize what has been going on. It provides you real cut through of what is going right and wrong in the business. And because what I tell founders, because it's so hard to actually share the ugly. Nobody ever wants to share the ugly, especially to lots of people who give you money or you really trust, etc. But what I always tell our founders is the only way you're gonna get help is to ask for help and actually tell people what's going wrong, right? Because there is no other way. And actually getting into that practice of asking for help, that is actually what's going to propel your business. That's the only way for the whole community come around you, really.
Fantastic. And there has been a recent news in the startup world regarding the Silicon Valley Bank. We have all been hearing about that and the collapse that it faced. Do you think that it's the biggest challenge that the startups face? These kind of crashes where they invested their money in, and it crashed all of a sudden. Next morning, you get up and you say, "Oh, what was that?" So, what kind of challenges do you think startups face in 2023 moving from here? Not only in terms of these kind of things which happened in this month, but other than that, also, are there any specific challenges that you think the startups are facing in 23?
Yeah, totally. I mean, Silicon Valley Bank was fortunately a short-lived challenge. We'll see what actually happens off the back of it, but it was very fortunate. Not a massive trigger just yet. In terms of challenges for 2023 and beyond, I would actually say there's probably two largest ones, and they're related as well. The first one is talent. And what I mean by that is the one in which every startup has, where startups, if you think about the startup, it's essentially a small company of a couple of people. You don't have much cut through. You don't have many people who even pay attention to you. So the hardest thing to do is actually hire great people. So essentially what you're always going to do is hire your friends and family because they're the people who are actually listening. They're the people who actually pay attention to you. So the hardest thing to do is actually getting outside of the little bubble and hiring great people, especially diverse set of mindsets from different areas and so on. So that is actually the largest challenge, especially as it's getting more competitive globally. You can work remotely, etc. Everybody's competing for the same talent now. The second one, which is related, is actually attention. And again, because the world is getting so busy, there's so many social media channels, there's so much content just out there. Getting the attention from customers, from talent, from investors, and so on, that is actually a massive, massive challenge as well. And the way to deal with it is again those kind of monthly updates, putting yourself out there, asking for help, creating a community around you, etc. There's a bunch of different ways to deal with it, but talent and attention, I reckon, in 2023 are going to be massive.
Yeah.
Where do you see external forces? Things like in Australia, the constant increase of interest rates, and what happens if we get another COVID and things like that. Where do you see that impacting in a business, and in particular in the startup area?
Yeah, great questions. I mean, I wouldn't dare to predict anything like COVID and black swan events because I just have no idea what would happen, because there's just
I'm not necessarily, Michael, talking about predicting them, but when something like that happens.
Yeah. The one or what is happening, maybe that's kind of an interesting one, as you mentioned, of increasing interest rates. That's actually a really interesting one on capital markets and how does that affect startups? Interestingly, the private markets, so venture capital in particular, which funds startups, has a bit of a lag on public markets, which is an interesting dynamic there, right? Because even when interest rates increase, there is no immediate impact on startups because VC funds are already raised, money is already committed, and VC funds essentially have a mandate to deploy within 2 to 3 years. So even if the world crashes and burns, VC funds have to deploy the money over the next 2 to 3 years. So you have this delayed effect in time to recover, which is kind of interesting. And so therefore, the effect on startups, you actually wouldn't feel that until VC funds struggle to raise money from their LPs because interest rates rose. and then the effect actually kind of gets delayed by 3 or 4 years. Yeah, so in short, my answer would be no immediate effect, but like a delayed kind of time effect on public markets.
So you said your product or company market segment agnostic, but is there a preferred area, or you genuinely come one, come all?
Yeah, the only restriction that we have is that it's the founders are in Australia or New Zealand. So we've got a very much like a country region focus. And in terms of preference, we are fortunate enough that we don't look at industry trends, because we invest in like companies which are going to be around for 10 or 20 years. If I followed every single AI trend and Web3 trend and so on, we would be literally just like changing our investment strategy every 6 months. Whereas we are very much the long-term investor. And again, like we just believe in the founder themselves, that they have figured out something that they can actually change the world, whatever industry that is. Honestly, often the most boring industries are the most exciting ones, because that's actually the ones where things are sleepy and genuinely need a bit of a shake-up.
Yeah, fair enough.
So, as we're talking about diversity, Michael, I just opened and I just did a very quick research on Google. People are not used to researching on Google these days. Everyone is researching on ChatGPT, but I did it on Google, and I found that according to 2015 McKinsey report on 366 public companies, found out that those in the top quartile, top 25% for ethnic and racial diversity in management were 35% more likely to have financial returns above their industry means. And those in the top quartile for gender diversity were 15% more likely to have returns above the industry mean. So, and I've personally encountered this while I was in uni, and now while I'm working at a company, that when you have diverse people, you kind of learn a lot from different people, and they challenge your way of thinking, because you have come from a different country and different background. They've come from a different culture, and everyone has got different ways of looking into the same thing. Do you think that diversity really plays a big role in the way you kind of have those initial team members growing in a startup?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're a massive proponent of diversity itself. Like to the extent we've literally built initiatives around it. Like at Startmate, we've especially gone really deep in gender diversity itself. So we've got now, for example, a women fellowship, which was actually our first fellowship, where we bring 200 new women into startups from corporate, hospitality, retail, etc. And that was actually our way to just really bottoms up help the industry hire more women. That in itself is just such a long journey as well, because the stats also say that like in terms of startup funding, there's way less women actually getting funded and so on. At Startmate, because we start the journey so early on, as I mentioned, we believe in people before they believe in themselves. We actually go so early that we go into students, into athletes and so on, like before they even think about starting a startup. We can actually affect our diversity metrics from the very grassroots. And that also then, fortunately for us, translates all the way into the startup investments. So our stats, for example, are compared to industry averages of like 2 to 5% of companies are women founded. At Startmate, it's actually 40% of our companies that we fund actually have a woman co-founder. And those are actually stats that we really care about. And again, like it's not like a thing that you can just consider all the way at the end, at the investment stage. You actually have to consider it way, way, way earlier in the funnel to actually affect it. So yeah, it's super close to my heart. It's very close to the Startmate strategy as well.
And what do you think about this, George? So does diversity really play a critical role in the growth of a company? Do you have any examples from your experience?
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. If you're all drinking from the same glass, you're not getting any sort of variance in your thinking. So I was involved in a company a number of years ago. 3 of the directors that took over the company were what I called including myself, were the disciples of the chairman. We'd all been with him for 10 years, 12 years, 13 years. So if he was our coach, he was our mentor, he was our leader, and then we became the board of directors in a company that he had 60% and we had 40%. Obviously, our thinking is going to be very similar to his because he's the guy that taught us, right? So I was fortunate enough in that company to assume the role of managing director. And the first bloke I invited onto our board was our external accountant, chartered accountant, and he and I did not get on well at all. And the chairman, who he was like an adopted father to me. He said to me, what would possibly possess you to invite him on the board? You two don't even get on. And I said, well, everything that you say and everything that I say is always going to sound similar because I learned from you. And so I have a similar view. And the other two are going to be similar again. If he agrees with me, it's not because he likes me. If he agrees with me, it's not because he's a salesman. He's an accountant. So the other thing that we did is our general manager was actually an accountant also. And so we invited him into the board meetings. And so what you had the managing director, the chairman of the board, and two other directors, all from sales. And the managing director, being me, having learnt a lot of his craft and skills from the chairman of the board. And then you had two, and I don't say this with any disrespect, you then had two bean counters. You had two accountants that they don't buy into the blue sky. They don't go into the imagination. What they go into is, show me the money. Show me the figures. And so then your thinking starts to be, you have to have visionary thinking if you want a company to grow. I don't know of any company that I can think of that's been run by a non-visionary accountant that has grown. So you need vision, but you also need somebody to count the bloody money, because anybody with vision, any inventor, any creator, they're the last person that you're going to rely on being very, very practical with money. They're a creative. So I'm all for diversity. And women, I got to tell you, this country does not, well, probably many countries around the world, but this country in particular does not understand how bloody good women are if they're given an opportunity.
Well, thank you so much, George, for that.
It was a brief dissertation.
Well, I knew that story, and that was the reason I passed it on to you, because I've heard that story from you before, and I wanted you to share that story with the audience, because I know that when you have people who think differently than you in the same team, it really adds to a lot of value, and you learn a lot from them, because there's someone who is criticizing you, and I need to really sometimes listen to them. Because feedback is always not about getting good feedback. It's also about having a critical feedback on you. And I always appreciate critical feedback on myself. I keep on getting critical feedback from all corners of life. But it's all up to you how you kind of look into that and react to that feedback. Yep. One of the last questions from my side, Michael, for you will be towards this thing, that there are a lot of lessons that founders would love to learn at the end of the day. We have discussed about a couple of them, but is there anything that you want to rank in number 1, 2, and 3, that these are the lessons that anybody who is kind of starting their own business or entering into the startup world should have or should learn?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the first one is something that I always keep coming back to, and without fail, I'm always going to tell startups this is actually the most important thing, which is customers. Just never get distracted from it. Like whatever investors tell you, whatever anyone else tells you, like customers are actually the most important stakeholder you have. Keep talking to them, emailing them, do the hard things. It is super hard to actually pick up the phone and call people out of the blue. But it actually is just, it keeps you grounded to what you're actually trying to change. It keeps you grounded to the person whose life you're actually going to make better. The second one is around people. So it's like essentially the culture itself. Like, so many people think that you can actually change the culture later. It comes after you've done X task or Y task, and you can actually focus on that later. But culture starts from day one. It's kind of like created kind of working environment that you love to be part of, because you're excited to be working there, because it is the right kind of cultural norms and values that you're actually representing, because those things carry through, and you can't fix culture later down the line. And the third one is probably just double down on what I mentioned earlier already. Is kind of this one of share your hardships, share with family and friends and with your investors of what is going on, because when you are in trouble, that's the only way to get out of trouble, so people can actually help you. And when great things happen, then the people want to be celebrating with you, right? So it's literally like you get the best out of both worlds. You actually get people on board with your mission and vision and excited about what you're doing.
Excellent. I think those three are really, really good ones that you have shared. Out of those three, any of those that you want to kind of elaborate more on, Michael? Is there any of those elements you feel that is really, really indispensable? So I know culture is one important asset that you discussed. I definitely feel culture is a big thing. If you have set a wrong culture, then that kind of exponentially has a ripple effect, as in how you keep on growing the team, isn't it?
Absolutely. So like, honestly, like, if we're gonna double click on culture, it's such an interesting one where like, I mean, there's a classic quote as well. It's like, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Of it doesn't matter how awesome your strategy is, how great the execution is of self. If you don't have the right set of people around you, and they actually are excited to be coming to work and doing the best work of their lives, then everything else falls apart. At the end of the day, a company is just a set of its people. And the only other tip I would maybe have with culture is just kind of like the interesting one as a founder, as a CEO, where it's important for you to hold your team accountable. And culture is kind of the things that you walk past on is another kind of definition of culture. But another tip that I would actually have is to look into having somebody to hold you accountable as a CEO and as a founder. It's actually quite an interesting concept of the board itself is great, but it usually just a couple of steps removed, because the board meetings are not as often, are not as deep. So what I can always recommend is actually getting an executive coach or something, or a coach themselves who is actually impartial, who will actually tell you the real story and the real kind of ask you the real hard questions, and you can essentially share everything and anything. So I might actually leave it at that, of get an executive coach.
Michael, I think that is a brilliant, brilliant concept. I believe that everybody should have a business coach and advisor that's external. And that has nothing to do with me having a company that is a business coaching and advising company.
I didn't even know that. There we go.
If nothing else, I will play this part of our podcast often, Michael.
Excellent.
Do you have any questions? Because I'm done with my questions. George, do you have any final questions?
No, I just would like to add to what Michael was saying. I think it's important for people that are in business, and in particular in startups, it's important for them to know how good they are, because quite often people go in and they don't appreciate just how talented they are. And so what happens is fear takes over, and they don't actually go as far as they could because they don't understand how good they are. But sometimes the bigger mistake, and not all the times, but sometimes the bigger mistake is they don't realize how good they're not. And what I mean by that is you have to be supremely confident and be prepared to carry what you're good at. But you cannot be so egotistical that you can't understand, now I've reached the limit, I need to bring in a smarter cookie in this area. I need to bring somebody with a bit more expertise. And so that's a fine juggling act, because some people are not confident enough and some people are overconfident, and either one of those traits can actually bring you undone.
Well, sometimes you're not able to judge the person by the CV. We talked about CV or career, and it's all about the mindset and attitude. I think George, you and we have discussed about this a couple of times, that it's not always about what's written in the paper, but it's also about what's your mindset. Are you really positive enough to do certain things that you want to achieve? And I think, as you say, that whatever you have thought in the mind, it can only turn into action if you have actually thought about it. You haven't thought about it, how can you think of achieving it? If on the first day of a new quarter you say that you're not going to achieve anything for that quarter, you're never going to achieve that, because that's how you think. But if you say that I'll be achieving twice my target, at least you have set an ambition for yourself that you're going to do certain things, and then you start taking action in that right direction. And I think that kind of applies in all virtues, I feel. Well, if there are no other questions, we're going to wrap up for today's episode. Well, thank you so much, Michael. I appreciate you spending time with us. And do you have any final comments before we wrap up for today?
No, that's it for me. Thank you so much for having me.
This is an Ultimate Global Podcast. Hello, and welcome to our special weekly podcast on trending international and social affairs. You're listening to Saurabh Kora and George Mavros from Sydney.